The rain had been falling since dawn, soft but steady, turning the streets into long mirrors of light. A young nurse walked slowly under her umbrella, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles as she headed toward the bus stop. Her night shift had just ended, and her body ached with the kind of tiredness only long hours and restless hearts could bring. She wasn't thinking about much, just the warmth of her small apartment, a cup of tea, and maybe a few hours of peace before she had to do it all over again. The hospital where she worked wasn't large, but it carried the weight of too many sick people in too few hands. She loved helping others, but some days it felt like the world was just an endless chain of pain, and trying to keep up with it all left her numb. That morning, as she left the bright lights of the ward behind, she told herself she wouldn't stop for anything. She just wanted to go home. But life has a way of interrupting plans. As she passed a quiet gas station near the corner, she noticed something out of place. A young man sitting near the curb, hunched forward, his hands covering his face. He was soaked to the bone, his jacket clinging to his shoulders, his breathing uneven like he'd run for miles. People were walking past him, pretending not to see. A delivery truck stopped for a moment. The driver glanced his way, then pulled off again. Something about the sight made her pause. She hesitated. She could have kept walking. It wasn't her problem. But she couldn't. Maybe it was habit. After years of watching patients struggle, she couldn't ignore someone who looked like they were in trouble. She closed her umbrella and walked closer. "Hey," she said softly. "Are you okay?" The man lifted his head slightly. His eyes were dull, tired, and distant. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he tried to stand but stumbled, almost falling. She reached out, catching his arm just in time. His skin felt hot, too hot. His lips were pale. He whispered something, but the rain swallowed his words. "You're burning up," she said, her voice calm but concerned. "You need to get somewhere warm." He shook his head. "No hospital." "I'll be fine," he murmured, his voice hoarse and weak. "You're not fine," she replied. "You can barely stand." He tried to pull away again, but his strength gave out. Without thinking, she waved to a taxi passing by. The driver rolled down the window, clearly hesitant about picking up a soaked stranger, but she quickly explained. "He's sick. Please, I just need to get him to the clinic." The driver sighed but unlocked the doors. She helped the man inside, her heart racing. She didn't know who he was or what had happened to him, but something deep inside her said she couldn't just walk away. At the small community clinic, nurses rushed to help as soon as they saw his condition. They laid him on a stretcher, wrapped him in blankets, and began checking his vitals. His fever was dangerously high. When they asked for his name, he stayed silent. When they asked for identification, he didn't respond. He just stared at the ceiling, lost somewhere far away. The nurse who brought him in stood by his side, watching as the doctors worked. She explained how she found him, her voice low but steady. The staff asked if she was a relative. She shook her head, saying she'd never seen him before. Still, when the receptionist asked someone to sign the emergency forms, she stepped forward and wrote her own name. Hours passed. She waited in the hallway, damp and exhausted. The rain outside kept falling, tapping gently against the windows. She didn't understand why she felt the need to stay. She could have gone home. Her part was done. But something made her stay in that quiet waiting room, staring at the empty cup of vending machine coffee and hoping he would be okay. Late in the afternoon, a doctor came out with a faint smile. "He's stable now," he said. "Severe pneumonia and dehydration, but he's lucky you brought him in when you did." Relief washed over her like a wave. "Can I see him?" she asked. The doctor nodded. "He's still weak, but a familiar face might help." When she entered the small recovery room, the man was lying quietly under the blanket. He looked cleaner now, his hair brushed back, his breathing steadier. His eyes opened slowly as she stepped closer. "You stayed?" he asked weakly. "Of course," she said. "Someone had to make sure you didn't sneak out again." A faint smile touched his lips. "Thank you." "I don't even know your name," she told him, then added gently, "You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. Just rest." He nodded slightly. For a few moments, neither spoke. The hum of machines filled the silence, and outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Over the next few days, she visited him whenever her shift allowed. He started to regain strength. He ate little at first, then more each day. The clinic's staff grew curious about the man with no past, no documents, and no family. When anyone asked questions, he'd deflect or smile quietly. but with her he seemed a little more open. One afternoon, as she checked his temperature, he said softly, "You could have walked past. Why didn't you?" She thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because someone once stopped for me when I needed help. I guess I just wanted to pass it on." He looked at her for a long time, like he was trying to understand something far beyond those words. Then he nodded. "Not many people do that anymore." She smiled lightly. "Then maybe it's time more people started." Sometimes he'd sit quietly and stare out the window, his expression far away. Once she noticed faint scars along his wrists, thin lines that told stories she didn't dare ask about. She didn't press him for answers. She figured he would talk when he was ready. On the 5th day, he was well enough to walk a little. She found him standing near the window, watching the rain again. It had become a strange connection between them. The sound of rain, the smell of wet streets, and the quiet moments that didn't need words. "You'll be discharged soon," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Then you can get some proper rest." He nodded, still looking outside. "I owe you my life," she laughed softly. "You don't owe me anything. Just take care of yourself." He turned to her, his eyes suddenly serious. "If I ever can repay this, I will. You have my word." She didn't think much of it. People said things when they were grateful. She smiled, wished him well, and went back to her rounds. The next morning when she returned, his bed was empty. The nurse on duty told her he'd checked out early. No one saw him leave. The only thing left behind was the blanket folded neatly and a short note that read, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." She stood there for a while, the note trembling slightly in her hands. A strange sadness filled her chest. She didn't even know his name. She didn't know where he was going or if he'd ever come back. But she felt certain she had met him for a reason. For the next few days, she went back to her usual routine. The world outside went on as always. The same crowded buses, the same patients, the same quiet evenings. But sometimes when she passed the gas station where she'd found him, she slowed down. The rain would fall again, and she'd remember the look on his face, the exhaustion in his voice, and the quiet way he said thank you. She never told anyone about that night. It felt too personal, too fragile to explain. Helping strangers wasn't new to her, it was her job. But this felt different. It wasn't about duty, it was about something deeper, something that reached beyond words. She didn't know that far away. People were searching desperately for a man who had vanished. A man whose disappearance had drawn the attention of governments, reporters and business leaders around the world. She didn't know that the same quiet soul she helped was someone the world believed was already gone. For her, he was just a person in need, someone lost in the rain, someone she couldn't leave behind. And that simple decision to stop, to care, to listen was about to ripple far beyond her small world. It would reach across oceans, through screens and stories, and touch millions of lives in ways she could never imagine. But that morning, as she walked home again, umbrella in hand, she didn't think about any of that. She just looked up at the gray sky, watched the rain fall, and smiled quietly to herself because sometimes, even the smallest acts of kindness can rewrite the stories of the world. A week had passed since that rainy morning, but she still found herself thinking about the man she helped. Every time she walked to work, she glanced at the gas station, half expecting to see him sitting there again, though she knew she wouldn't. He was gone, like a passing shadow that left behind a quiet space in her memory. Work at the hospital was as demanding as ever. The emergency ward buzzed with the sounds of machines, quiet voices, and the constant footsteps of tired nurses and doctors. Life there didn't slow down for anyone. Yet somewhere deep inside she carried a faint restlessness, a feeling she couldn't name. On her break, she sometimes looked out the window of the cafeteria, wondering where he might be. Did he have a home? Did he recover completely? Was he eating well? She didn't even know his name. But something about his eyes, the quiet sadness in them, made her wish she had asked more questions. One rainy evening, she returned home late. Her small apartment smelled faintly of coffee and clean laundry. She set her bag down, changed into her pajamas, and sat by the window. Outside, the city lights blurred through raindrops, and the world seemed strangely peaceful. She turned on the TV absent-mindedly. The news was running. The usual stories of politics, storms, and accidents. She wasn't really paying attention until the anchor's tone changed. The words "breaking news" flashed across the screen. A global search for missing billionaire inventor Daniel Reeves continues, the reporter said. Authorities confirmed today that Reeves, founder of the Waterlight Foundation, was last seen nearly 3 months ago. His family and international teams have been offering a large reward for any information leading to his safe return. She looked up, half listening. The photo on the screen showed a man in a formal suit, clean-shaven with bright, intelligent eyes. There was something familiar about his face, the shape of his jaw, the quiet seriousness. She frowned, leaning closer. It couldn't be. No, she thought, it just looked similar. The reporter continued. Known for his groundbreaking work in clean water technology, Reeves' innovations have changed millions of lives. His disappearance shocked the world, and new reports suggest he might have been targeted by groups opposing his environmental reforms. Her heartbeat quickened. The more she stared, the harder it became to shake the thought. What if it was him, the man she found that rainy morning, the one with no ID, no answers, and eyes full of silence, looked almost exactly like this? She shook her head, trying to brush it off. It couldn't be possible. Why would someone like that be sitting alone on a sidewalk, sick and weak? Still, she couldn't ignore the resemblance. The next day at the hospital, she mentioned it quietly to one of her co-workers while they were preparing supplies. You think it could be him? Her colleague asked, surprised. That billionaire guy? The one who vanished? I don't know, she admitted. The man I helped looked rough, like he'd been through something awful. But their faces, they're almost the same. Her coworker shrugged. Maybe just a coincidence. I mean, people go missing all the time. But billionaires? They have security, cameras, everything. Yeah, she said softly. Maybe you're right. Still, the thought wouldn't leave her. Later that week, the hospital received an unexpected call. A representative from an international foundation wanted to schedule a donation meeting. The hospital staff were thrilled. It wasn't often that big organizations took notice of their small facility. Posters were printed, a press team arrived, and everyone was asked to look their best for the visit. On the day of the event, she stood near the back of the hall holding a clipboard, watching as the director greeted the guests. Cameras flashed and reporters whispered quietly among themselves. Then the doors opened and a tall man walked in, dressed neatly in a simple gray suit. Her heart almost stopped. It was him. He looked healthier, stronger, and more composed than before, but she recognized him instantly. The eyes, the voice, the quiet way he moved. He walked straight to the hospital director, shook hands, and smiled politely for the cameras. The whispers in the room grew louder as people realized who he was. The reporters began murmuring his name, the same name she'd heard on the news just days ago. Daniel Reeves. The world believed he had been missing for months. Yet here he was, alive and standing just a few feet away. Her breath caught as their eyes met for the first time since that night. For a second, everything around her faded. The flashes, the murmurs, the speeches. It was just the two of them, remembering something quiet and human that the world around them couldn't see. He gave a small, almost invisible smile, the kind that held both gratitude and recognition. After the event ended, while the crowd swirled around him, she tried to slip away quietly. But as she turned the corner near the staff lounge, she heard a familiar voice. You didn't tell anyone, he said behind her. She stopped and turned. He was standing there, away from the cameras, holding a small folder under his arm. You left before I could, she said softly, and no one would have believed me anyway. He smiled faintly. Maybe that was for the best. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then she asked, Was it really you on the news? The one everyone was searching for? He nodded slowly. Yes, I disappeared for a while. Let's just say I needed to find a place where no one knew who I was. Her eyes softened. And you ended up outside a gas station in the rain. He gave a quiet laugh. That night I thought I was done for. But then you showed up. You didn't ask questions. You didn't take pictures. You just helped. You have no idea what that meant. I just did what anyone would do, she said gently. He shook his head. No, not anyone. Most people looked away. You didn't. Before she could say anything else, one of his assistants came around the corner, reminding him that the press was waiting. He turned back to her. I'll find a way to thank you properly, he said, his tone sincere. But for now, promise me you'll stay just as you are. The world needs more people like you. She smiled, a little embarrassed. You don't owe me anything. He hesitated for a moment, then said quietly, "Maybe not, but I owe the world a second chance because of you." He left before she could reply, disappearing into the crowd of photographers and journalists waiting outside. That night, she returned home feeling like she'd dreamed the whole thing, but the next morning her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages poured in. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives had seen the news. The story was everywhere. Billionaire Daniel Reeves found alive, rescued by unknown woman during disappearance. News outlets around the world were covering it. Some called it a miracle. Others called it fate. But what caught everyone's attention was the photo. A security camera image from the clinic showing her walking beside him, holding his arm. Her name wasn't mentioned at first, but it didn't take long for people to figure it out. The hospital confirmed she was the nurse who had signed his paperwork that night. Reporters began showing up outside her building, asking questions, offering interviews. At first, she tried to avoid the attention. She didn't want fame or praise. She had only done what felt right. But as the days went on, messages started arriving from strangers all over the world. People thanking her, saying her kindness had inspired them to help others. Some sent letters, some just wrote simple words. "You reminded us that good still exists." Her quiet life suddenly became public. Cameras followed her to work. Her story was shared on talk shows and newspapers and online videos. She was offered awards, invitations, and even money, all of which she politely refused. She didn't want to be a symbol. She wanted to stay herself, the same person who walked home in the rain, tired and ordinary. But Daniel didn't forget her. A few weeks later, she received a letter, hand-delivered with no return address. Inside was a short note in his handwriting. "You saved one life, but your kindness will save millions. Thank you, Wood, for reminding me what matters." Along with it was a small silver pin engraved with the words, "For those who still care." From that moment, something in her changed. She realized that what she had done wasn't small after all. It wasn't just about helping a stranger. It was about believing that compassion still had power in a world that often forgot what it meant to be human. She continued her work quietly, though now the world watched her with admiration. Every time it rained, she would pause by the window, remembering that night, not because she had saved someone important, but because she had chosen to see someone that others ignored. And somewhere across oceans and continents, the man she once saved was building something new, something that would soon change everything. She didn't know it yet, but her single act of kindness had just begun to echo around the world. The story spread faster than anyone expected. Within a few days, news channels all over the world were talking about it. The mysterious disappearance, the rescue, and the quiet nurse who had unknowingly saved one of the most influential men on the planet. Every station had its version of what happened. Some called it luck, some called it destiny, and others said it was proof that even a single act of kindness could change everything. At first, she didn't understand how big it had become. She tried to ignore the cameras parked outside her small apartment. She avoided interviews and turned down offers to appear on talk shows. To her, it still didn't feel like anything extraordinary. She didn't save him because he was famous or powerful. She helped him because he was a human being who needed help. But the world saw it differently. At the hospital, her co-workers treated her differently too. Some smiled proudly, calling her a hero. Others whispered quietly behind her back, saying she was lucky that anyone in her position would have done the same. But she didn't argue. She just kept doing her job, quietly moving through her shifts like always. One morning, as she entered the ward, the hospital director called her into his office. He smiled warmly, offering her a seat. "There's someone here to see you," he said. She hesitated, confused. "Who?" Before he could answer, the door opened, and there he was again. He looked different this time. Healthier, more confident, dressed simply but with a calm that drew everyone's attention. The moment their eyes met, she felt the same quiet recognition as before, the same connection that words couldn't describe. "I hope I'm not disturbing your day," he said with a gentle smile. She shook her head. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I wanted to," he replied. "There's something I need to say, and something I need to give you." The director quietly stepped out, leaving them alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the rain outside filled the silence again, as if the weather remembered that night just as they did. He took a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a letter, written in his own handwriting. "I wanted to tell you what really happened," he said softly. "The truth, because the world doesn't know everything." She looked at him, waiting quietly. "I wasn't just missing," he continued. "I was running. There were people who wanted to stop my work, the projects I built to bring clean water to poor regions, to places where companies couldn't profit. I was warned, but I didn't listen. Then one night I barely escaped an attack that destroyed my car. I ran for hours. I hid wherever I could. By the time you found me, I hadn't eaten or slept for days. I thought it was over." Her eyes softened as she listened. "You didn't have to explain. I'm just glad you're safe." He smiled faintly. "But I wanted you to know that when you stopped that night, you didn't just save me. You saved the future of everything I was working for. If you hadn't helped my plans, my people, all of it would have been lost." She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything special." He shook his head. "You did something that most people wouldn't. You saw me as a person, not a story. That's what matters." For a long moment there was quiet between them. Then he said, "I've started something new, a foundation in your honor. It's called the Quiet Hands Project. It will support small hospitals, nurses, and caregivers who make a difference every day, just like you." Her eyes widened. "You named it after me?" "Inspired by you," he said gently. "You reminded me what humanity looks like when everything else is stripped away." She didn't know what to say. Gratitude, shock, and humility filled her heart all at once. "I don't know if I deserve that," she murmured. He smiled. "You already do." Over the next few weeks, the story continued to grow. The foundation was launched publicly, and her name was mentioned in speeches and articles across the world. People began calling her the nurse who saved hope. She never asked for that title, but she carried it with quiet grace. Invitations poured in, and from conferences, universities, and charities, asking her to speak about kindness, empathy, and human values. She refused most of them, saying she wasn't a speaker, just a nurse. But one day, when the foundation invited her to attend its opening ceremony, she finally agreed. The event took place in a large hall filled with people from every corner of the world. Doctors, scientists, volunteers, and journalists. Cameras lined the back walls, and a hush fell over the audience as he stepped onto the stage. He began his speech by talking about his disappearance, his survival, and how one small act changed everything. "In a world where people walk past strangers," he said. She stopped. "In a world where kindness is often forgotten," she remembered. And because of her, I remembered too. When he invited her to the stage, the room erupted in applause. She walked up slowly, her hands trembling slightly, her heart racing. She wasn't used to crowds or cameras, but when she stood beside him, the noise faded, and she felt calm again. He handed her a small medal, engraved with her name and the words, "One act can change the world." She spoke only a few words, her voice gentle but steady. "I didn't know who he was that night. I didn't help him for a reason. I just saw someone who needed help. If there's one thing I learned, it's that kindness never asks for anything in return. It just gives." The audience stood in silence, then broke into applause so thunderous it filled the entire hall. Many had tears in their eyes. From that day forward, her life changed in ways she could never have imagined. She began traveling to small towns and clinics supported by the foundation, meeting other nurses, caregivers, and volunteers who worked quietly behind the scenes. Everywhere she went, people wanted to meet her, to thank her, to tell her that her story had given them hope again. But through it all, she remained the same. Humble, grounded, and quietly strong. She never saw herself as a hero. She was just someone who believed that no act of kindness was ever wasted. One evening, months after the ceremony, she sat by the river near the city park. The air was cool, and the sunset painted the water gold. She had finished another long day at work and finally had a few quiet minutes to herself. She watched as families walked by, children laughed, and people fed birds near the edge of the water. Then, as if drawn by fate, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Still avoiding interviews?" She turned and smiled. It was him again. "I think I've had enough of cameras for a lifetime," she said lightly. He sat beside her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. They just watched the river flow, the way they had once listened to the rain. "You know," he said softly, "when I think about that night, I still can't believe it happened. I spent years building machines and systems to make life better for others. But it was your heart and not any invention that reminded me why I started." She smiled faintly. "You're giving me too much credit." "Not enough," he said simply. "You saved my life. That's not something I'll ever forget." They sat quietly, watching the sky darken. The city lights began to sparkle on the surface of the water, like stars finding their reflection. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Do you ever think about how small moments can change everything? If I had been just a few minutes late that morning, or if I'd taken another route home?" He nodded slowly. "Then the world would have lost something beautiful." She looked at him, unsure what to say. He smiled softly as if reading her thoughts. "You taught me something I'll never forget," he continued. "That real power doesn't come from money or fame. It comes from compassion, from caring when no one else does." She didn't reply, but the warmth in her eyes said everything. As they sat there, a gentle rain began to fall again, soft and familiar. They both laughed quietly and didn't bother to move. The drops tapped lightly against their shoulders, the same way they had that first night. For her, it was a reminder that life had come full circle. That a simple act on a rainy night had led to something far greater than she could have imagined. For him, it was a promise that he would spend the rest of his life trying to honor the kindness that saved him. Neither of them knew what the future would hold. But one thing was certain: the world would never forget her, not because she was famous, but because she had reminded everyone what it truly meant to be human. Months passed, and the story that began on a rainy night had turned into something far bigger than she ever imagined. The world had taken her quiet act and turned it into a symbol, a message that kindness still existed even in the middle of chaos and noise. Her life, once quiet and predictable, was now filled with unexpected moments that didn't always feel real. The foundation that bore her name had grown quickly. Clinics were being built in small towns. Villages that once struggled for clean water were now getting help. People she had never met were writing letters, saying her story gave them courage to help others. Some of the letters came from children, written in shaky handwriting. One read, "I want to be kind like you when I grow up." Every time she read something like that, her heart warmed, but a part of her still felt shy. She never liked being the center of attention. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to go back to her normal life, to walking to the hospital in the morning, to drinking tea by her window at night. But the world didn't let her fade into the background anymore. The man she saved made sure of that. He often mentioned her name in speeches, interviews, and public talks. He would tell audiences about how one person's compassion brought him back from a place where he had lost hope. He never exaggerated. He spoke simply but with so much emotion that people couldn't help but listen. Every time he mentioned her, the crowd would go silent, hanging on to every word. One day, she was invited to travel with the foundation to another country. The trip was meant to visit new medical centers and meet the teams helping with clean water systems. She hesitated at first. She had never been on an airplane before. But the idea of seeing how far that one small act had reached made her say yes. The journey changed her. When she stepped off the plane, hundreds of people were waiting, holding signs that said thank you in different languages. Children ran forward with flowers. Older women reached out to touch her hand as if she carried something holy. It was overwhelming. She smiled politely, though her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined kindness could travel this far. The new clinic was built on the edge of a dry village where water was scarce. The building was simple, white walls, blue roof, but it shone like hope in the sunlight. Inside, the rooms were small but clean. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the scent of medicine. The staff greeted her warmly, saying they had waited for this day. She spoke softly to them, thanking them for their work. They told her that because of the foundation, families who once walked miles for water now had clean wells nearby. Babies who would have died from infections were now being treated in those very rooms. It was hard for her to hold back her emotions. That night, she stood outside the clinic looking at the stars. The man she once saved walked up beside her, silent for a while. Then he said, "You see what you started?" She smiled faintly. "I didn't start anything." "You did." He shook his head. "No, you gave me a reason to start again." She didn't reply. The wind carried the sound of laughter from the village, and for a while they both stood quietly, watching children play under the soft glow of lanterns. As the months turned into a year, her name continued to grow, not because she tried to be famous, but because her story was shared again and again. People called her the nurse who reminded the world. Schools taught her story and lessons about empathy. Documentaries were made showing her visit to different communities. She never played the role of a celebrity. She remained herself, gentle, humble, and quietly strong. She still worked at her hospital when she was home. Even though she could have left that job and lived comfortably, she didn't want to stop doing what she loved. Her patients didn't treat her like a hero. They just saw her as the same caring nurse who listened to their worries, held their hands, and smiled through long nights. That was exactly how she wanted it. One afternoon, after a long shift, she sat in the hospital garden with a cup of tea. The air was calm and the flowers swayed gently in the breeze. A young intern sat beside her and said, "Ma'am, how does it feel to be someone the world admires?" She looked at him and smiled softly. "Strange," she said, "because I don't feel like I did anything special. I just did what felt right." The intern nodded slowly. "I think that's why people admire you. Because it's real." Her smile widened. "Then I hope they remember that kindness isn't a story. It's a habit." Later that evening, she received a call from the foundation office. They were organizing a global event in her honor, a celebration of kindness that would bring together leaders, doctors, and volunteers from many countries. She didn't know what to say. She didn't want to be celebrated. But they insisted it was not just about her. It was about what her story had inspired in others. The event took place in a grand hall in the city. Large screens displayed images of villages, clinics, and schools that had been built under the foundation. People from different countries filled the room, each carrying stories of how small acts of care had changed lives. When she arrived, she wore a simple white dress and a small pin, the one that had been gifted to her months earlier. As she walked through the crowd, people stood clapping softly. She felt a lump rise in her throat. She never liked attention, but this was different. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the message that kindness still mattered. The man she saved stood on stage waiting for her. When she joined him, he looked at her with the same quiet respect he had that first day at the hospital. He began his speech by saying, "The night I was rescued, I thought my life had ended. But what she gave me was more than survival. It was purpose. I learned that true strength isn't measured by power or wealth, but by compassion. This foundation exists because of her, because she reminded me and the world that humanity begins with caring for one another." The audience rose to their feet in applause. Cameras flashed, but she hardly noticed. Her eyes were moist, her hands trembling slightly. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't have a prepared speech. She just spoke from her heart. "I'm not special," she began softly. "I didn't save anyone because I wanted recognition. I just saw someone who needed help. And that's something anyone can do. We don't have to wait for big moments to make a difference. Sometimes it's as simple as stopping, listening, or offering a hand. I believe kindness is a language everyone understands. And if my story means anything, I hope it reminds people that even a small act can travel farther than we think." The room was silent. Then, as if on cue, everyone began to applaud again. Not just politely, but with the kind of emotion that fills the air and lingers in the heart. That night, as she left the hall, she stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was cloudy and a light drizzle began to fall. She tilted her head back, letting the raindrops touch her face. It felt like the world's quiet way of saying thank you. The man joined her outside. They walked together without speaking, just listening to the rain. At one point he said quietly, "The world will never forget you, you know." She smiled faintly. "I don't want them to remember me. I just want them to remember the kindness." He looked at her, the rain catching in his hair. "They will. Because you've shown them what it looks like." She laughed softly. "Then maybe I've done my part." He nodded. "More than you'll ever know." They walked a little longer, their footsteps splashing in the puddles. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of thunder rolled softly, like an echo of that night when everything began. And in that quiet moment, under the same kind of rain that had once brought two strangers together, she realized that her story had never really been about her at all. It was about every person who still chose compassion over indifference, every person who still stopped when others walked by. It was about hope, the kind that doesn't fade with time. Years passed, and time moved with its quiet rhythm, just as it always did. The world changed, cities grew taller, people busier, and yet, her story somehow never faded. It was still spoken about in schools, shown in documentaries, and shared on television every year. Her name had become a symbol, but to those who really knew her, she was still the same gentle soul who once gave her coat to a stranger in the rain. After the grand event that honored her years earlier, she slowly returned to her ordinary life. Fame never sat comfortably on her shoulders. She liked simple things, watering her small garden in the mornings, reading old books, walking to the hospital down the same quiet street, and waving to her neighbors who still greeted her like they always did. The hospital where she worked had changed a lot since her story became known. There were new buildings, new staff, and more patients than ever before. But the heart of the place and the care, the humanity in it had grown stronger. Young doctors often said they joined because of her. She would smile at that, feeling both proud and shy. One morning, as she walked through the hallway with her worn-out clipboard, a patient's little daughter ran up to her and handed her a flower. The child said, "My mom says you're the lady who helps everyone." She bent down, took the flower gently, and said, "Your mom helps me too. We all help each other, don't we?" The girl nodded, smiling wide. Moments like that reminded her why she had never left this place. The man she had saved continued his mission with even greater passion. Over the years, he built hundreds of centers for education, healthcare, and clean water access, all carrying the foundation's symbol, 2 hands holding a droplet of water. He often wrote to her, even when his schedule was packed with meetings and travel. In his letters, he'd tell her about the people they were reaching, the lives being changed, and how her one decision on that rainy night had inspired millions. But what touched her most were not the awards, or the events, or the global attention. It was the small things, like the letters from mothers saying their children had clean water for the first time, the notes from young nurses saying they were inspired to treat patients with kindness, not just medicine, and sometimes the simple thank you written in shaky handwriting from someone far away. As the years went by, she began to slow down. The long hospital shifts became tiring, and her hands, once steady, sometimes trembled, but she refused to stop working completely. She told her colleagues, "As long as I can still hold someone's hand, I can still help." Eventually, she retired. Her co-workers threw her a small farewell gathering in the hospital's courtyard. There were no reporters, no cameras, just her friends and the people she had worked with for decades. They brought flowers, homemade food, and a simple cake with the words, "Thank you for everything." She laughed softly and said, "You're making me feel like I'm leaving forever." But deep down, she knew she was closing a chapter. When she went home that evening, the house felt quieter than usual. The walls were lined with memories, photos of her travels, letters framed on the shelves, and a small newspaper clipping that read, "Nurse who saved a stranger changed the world." She looked at it for a long time, then placed it back in a drawer. To her, the story was never about saving anyone. It was about being there for someone who needed it. Her days became peaceful. She spent mornings in her garden, talking to the flowers as if they were old friends. Neighbors often stopped by, bringing tea or fruit, saying they loved hearing her stories. She never spoke about fame or big events. She talked about her patients, the people she met, the laughter, and sometimes the quiet tears. One winter evening, she received a letter from the man she once helped. It was handwritten, just like the first one he sent years ago. It said, "I often think about that night, the way you didn't hesitate, the way you looked at me not as someone strange, but as a human being. Because of you, millions now have hope. I am traveling again soon, but before I go, I want to visit you. There's something I want to show you." True to his word, he arrived a few days later. Though both of them had aged, the connection between them remained the same. He brought with him a small box and handed it to her. Inside was a golden pin shaped like 2 hands holding a heart. He said, "This isn't an award. It's just a reminder of how one act of kindness can change the course of the world." She smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "You've already reminded me enough," she said. He stayed for tea and they talked for hours. When he left, he said, "You may not realize it, but your kindness lives in everything this foundation does." And one day when you're gone, your story will still light the way for others." She didn't say anything for a while. Then she replied, "If that's true, then I hope it reminds people that kindness isn't just an act. It's a choice we make every single day." Years passed again. Her hair turned completely white and her steps slowed, but her smile never faded. Children from the neighborhood still visited her small house, sitting around her like she was their grandmother. She would tell them gentle stories, not about heroes or fame, but about courage in small moments. She told them that kindness doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, like the sound of rain on the window. One morning, she didn't come out to tend her garden. Her neighbor knocked on the door and found her sitting peacefully in her chair, with a book in her lap and that golden pin still shining on her chest. It looked like she had simply fallen asleep. News spread quickly. The world mourned her as if it had lost a family member. Television channels showed her story again. The man she saved gave a heartfelt speech, his voice trembling with emotion. He said, "The woman who gave me life gave hope to humanity. Her kindness will live forever in the hearts of those who believe that compassion can change the world." In the following months, a new center was built in her honor, not a grand one, but simple, just like her. It was named the House of Gentle Hands. Inside, a small quote was engraved on the wall. "You never know who you are saving when you choose kindness." Visitors from all over came to see it. Some brought flowers, some just stood quietly, reading the inscription. Many wept softly, not out of sadness but gratitude. Years later, her story became part of lessons in schools around the world. Teachers told their students how one small act, giving a coat, helping a stranger, choosing to care, could ripple farther than anyone could imagine. Children listened with wide eyes, imagining the rainy night when it all began. The man she once helped grew old too. In his later years, he often visited the House of Gentle Hands. He would sit by the plaque and talk to her as if she were still there. He'd tell her about the new projects, the people they were helping, and how her spirit continued to inspire generations. Sometimes, visitors saw him sitting quietly by her picture and would stop, unsure whether to disturb him. But he would always turn, smile faintly, and say, "She's still here. Every act of kindness keeps her alive." And in many ways, she truly was still there. In every clinic built, in every child given clean water, in every nurse who chose patience and warmth over frustration. Her legacy wasn't made of fame or wealth. It was made of simple, honest compassion. Her story became a reminder that one person, even with no power or position, could touch millions of lives. She didn't know who she was saving that night, but the world would forever remember her for proving that love, when given freely, can move mountains. And so, her journey ended the way it began, quietly, gently, and with kindness. The rain still fell, the world still turned, and somewhere someone stopped to help another because they remembered her story. In the end, she didn't just save one life. She saved hope. And hope, unlike everything else, never dies. Decades had passed since she took her last breath, but her presence still lingered in places where kindness was alive. The small hospital where she once worked had changed, expanded, and evolved with time, but on one of its walls near the entrance, a simple picture still hung. It showed her standing outside the clinic on that first day of her recognition, holding a small child who had given her a flower. Beneath the photo, a short line was engraved: "Kindness doesn't end with time, and it begins again every day." Students, doctors, and visitors often paused to read it. Some smiled quietly, some wiped tears. Most didn't know her personally, but everyone knew her story. It had become part of history, taught in classrooms and shared in documentaries. The man she had once saved was now long gone too, but before his passing, he had made sure her foundation never lost its purpose. The organization had grown into one of the largest humanitarian efforts in the world, reaching places no government or corporation ever did. It worked in remote deserts, frozen mountains, and crowded cities, anywhere people needed help. Every new worker joining the foundation was told her story on their first day. They called it the rain lesson. It was the story of how one act of compassion in a rainy night had changed everything. They were reminded that numbers and projects meant little unless they carried the same heart she had. Years rolled by. The world kept changing. Technology advanced, people communicated faster, and life became busier. But even in the middle of all the noise, her story continued to touch hearts. There was a school in a small village built by the foundation decades ago. It had bright walls and a garden full of yellow flowers. In one classroom, a young teacher told her story every year to her students. She never read from a book. She told it like a friend sharing a memory. Long ago, she would begin, there was a nurse who stopped to help a stranger in the rain. She didn't know who he was, and she didn't care. All she saw was someone in pain. She gave her coat, her warmth, and her time, and that changed the world. The children always listened quietly. Some leaned forward, some whispered questions. One boy once asked, "Did she know she would become famous?" The teacher smiled and shook her head. "No, that's the beauty of it. She didn't do it to be known. She did it because she cared." Every year after the story, the children would draw pictures inspired by her life. Hands helping each other, hearts under umbrellas, people sharing food. The drawings were hung on the walls, colorful reminders of what compassion looked like in small hands. In another part of the world, a young doctor stood in front of a large crowd at a medical conference. He was presenting his new project, a mobile clinic that could travel across remote regions. The clinic was named The Light in the Rain. When asked why he chose that name, he smiled softly and said, "Because that's where this idea was born. In a story my grandmother told me about a woman who once saved a stranger without knowing who he was." The audience went silent. Many of them already knew the story he was talking about. It had become so universal that people didn't even need to hear her name to understand who he meant. They called her the woman in the rain, the nurse of hope, the heart of humanity. Her identity had grown beyond a person. She had become a symbol. Over time, cities began celebrating an annual day called the Day of Simple Kindness. It wasn't connected to any religion or country. It was a day when people were encouraged to do one small good deed: help someone cross the road, visit the sick, donate a meal, or simply smile at a stranger. The idea came from her story. Every year, people shared her quote online, "You never know who you are saving when you choose kindness." Social media platforms filled with stories tagged under her foundation's name. Videos of people helping others in her memory went viral. Some gave blankets to the homeless. Others helped stray animals or paid for someone's meal. It was as if the kindness she had once given had multiplied across generations. One evening at the House of Gentle Hands, the center built in her honor, a group of visitors gathered for an annual memorial. Among them were doctors, volunteers, students, and families whose lives had been changed by the foundation. Candles flickered softly, lighting up the bronze plaque that bore her face. A young woman walked to the front. She was nervous but determined. She began speaking softly, her voice shaking at first. "My grandmother was one of the first patients treated at the clinic she helped build," she said. "When I was little, my grandmother used to tell me that the nurse who made all this possible once said, 'Kindness doesn't need a reason.' That sentence stayed with me. And now I work as a nurse too. I came here tonight because I wanted to say thank you. Not just for her, but for everyone who believes in what she started." The audience applauded quietly. The room filled with emotion, but not sadness. Gratitude. Later that night, after the event ended, the young nurse stayed behind. She walked to the garden behind the center where a single statue stood. Not grand, just a life-sized figure of a woman holding an umbrella, her face calm and gentle. The rain began to fall softly and the sound echoed around her. She smiled and whispered, "I'll keep it going. I promise." The next morning, as sunlight poured over the building, volunteers prepared to leave for new missions. Trucks loaded with medicine, food, and clean water tanks drove out of the compound. Each truck carried a painted line on the side, "For her, for kindness." Generations kept passing, but her story stayed alive, not in books or films alone, but in people's hearts. The world continued to face challenges, wars, disasters, loss. Yet every time humanity seemed to forget compassion, her story resurfaced like a quiet reminder that goodness still exists. And it only takes one heart to prove it. Even in universities, when young people studied ethics or medicine, professors often began their lectures with her example. "Science can heal," one professor said, "but compassion gives healing its meaning." That's what she taught the world.